All right. Operation Northwoods Conspiracy Explained. Let's get it.
This was a struggle of Cuban patriots
I know this is a rabbit
against the
hole for
Cuban
sure. It
dictator.
goes deep.
On March 13th, 1962, the Joint Chiefs of Staff put this document in front of the Secretary of Defense for approval from the President. This is a memo prepared by the most senior leaders in the U.S. military, some of the most powerful men in the country. And they're asking for permission to execute a plan to lob mortar shells into their own military bases with some damage to installations, and then to make hijacking attempts against civilian air and surface craft.
Already, it's fucked. Like, dude, the shit. It's also a rabbit hole just under like going into all the operations the CIA and FBI is responsible for, like MK Ultra, which I'll probably make a video on sometime. Like, dude, it's a deep rabbit hole, that's for sure.
To blow things up on American soil and then to blame it all on Cuba.
The Cuban people have not yet spoken their final piece.
This operation never happened, but it almost did, and that gets to a big question. Why would some of America's most powerful leaders charged with safeguarding our nation think that their duty would require them to lie to and terrorize the American people?
Because, dude, if you don't have a reason to go to war, well, they're gonna make up one. War makes money, bruh. It's a business. When you have a ton of very powerful people that are profiting a lot off of it, war is just never gonna end. So,
in other words, why were they planning Operation Northwoods?
It is not the first time.
I mean, we also wanted Cuba. We also wanted Castro out. Like, really didn't like Castro. I know Kennedy didn't like him either. But I know the CIA just needed his approval to go ahead with operations. And he denied them because they were wanting to go too far.
Tanks have
They were
rolled
definitely
over
wanting to go
young
too
men and women.
far.
Let the record show that our restraint is not inexhaustible.
Before we dive into today's kind of insane video, I need to thank the sponsor, who I'm very grateful for. Thank you, BetterHelp.
Skip? I don't give a fuck, man.
Northwoods was a response to a problem the U.S. government had. They called it the Cuba problem. Cuba became a problem for the CIA when they watched this young activist with an affinity for cigars lead a communist
He did like his
revolution on the
cigars.
island, throwing out
Castro
the
definitely
American-friendly
loved his
dictator and
stogies.
nationalizing all the valuable land and industries that American businesses had been getting rich off for decades. This was the Cold War, and communism was now 90 miles away, threatening to spread to other countries in Latin America. Countries that American businesses also wanted to continue controlling and exploiting. And any day, this new leader could align with the Soviet Union, giving the U.S.'s biggest geopolitical rival a military base within breathing distance of Florida. So this was what the Joint Chiefs called their Cuba problem. The U.S. had a few
You gotta
solutions
spread democracy. Down with communism, up with democracy.
to their problem. First, they put an embargo on Cuba, blocking all U.S. exports to the country, except for food and medicine. Second, they stopped buying Cuba's
essentials.
largest export, sugar. This actually ended up backfiring when the Soviet Union stepped in to buy Cuban sugar, kicking off an economic alliance between these two communist countries, exactly what the U.S. didn't want. And third, the U.S. started making plans.
Dude, the amount of deception, like, the average American, I don't think, understands how much deception there has gone on within our own government. Like, yeah, you always hear nowadays that there's corruption, but if you dive deep into it, dude, it goes way deeper than the average person, I think, ever thinks of or understands. And it's been happening for a long time. Like, if you try telling someone about MK Ultra, that doesn't already know about it, dude, I don't think they would believe you. Because they would be like, oh, if that happened, I would have heard about it.
Plans to somehow get rid of Castro, to turn Cuba back into the American business-friendly client state, through whatever means necessary. In one of these secret plans, called Operation Zapata, the CIA recruited 1,500 Cuban exiles who fled to Miami during the Cuban Revolution. It was this little CIA-funded army, GAID 2506, and the goal was to have them invade Cuba and remove Castro from power. So the CIA trains them at this camp in the mountains of Guatemala, where they had just recently executed a coup and installed a US-friendly dictator. And right in the middle of the planning stages, AFK...
Like, I don't understand how the CIA has the ability nor their permission to have a whole like camp or town set up where they're training soldiers in Guatemala.
Friendly
No wonder they're hot-headed enough to think that they
dictator. And right
could kill Kennedy,
in
which
the
they
middle
probably
of the
did.
planning stages of this operation, JFK wins the presidency.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
And he inherits this scheme to
Goated ass quote. It's a goated ass quote right there.
invade Cuba using exiled Cubans. The CIA briefs him on it, this plan to fix the Cuba problem by forcibly unseating Castro using Cuban exiles. And after some debate, JFK approves the plan. So on the 17th of April 1961, they launched their invasion. Brigade 2506 landed on Playa Hidalgo.
I'm honestly surprised JFK even approved of just this invasion to begin with. Like, he later denies air support, I believe, which a lot of people within our own military started despising Kennedy for, because there were far more casualties than there would have been had Kennedy approved of air support, which is another reason why people think he was targeted.
With the plan to invade the island and spark a popular revolution against Castro.
The assault has begun on the dictatorship of Fidel Castro. Landings were effected by rebels at several...
But it was a complete failure. Castro had found out about the invasion ahead of time. A radio station on the beach had spotted the invading ships arriving and called for help.
Someone snitched. Who did it?
Several of the invading ships sank on the coral reef, and the invading forces were met with immediate resistance from Cuban armed forces, who defeated them within 3 days. Most of them were captured. 9 U.S. servicemen actually flew combat missions in support of this invasion, 4 of which were shot down and killed in the process, something the U.S. government and the CIA would go on to deny for almost 30 years.
See, like, it's known that the CIA lies and talks out of their ass so much. Like, you can almost never take their word for it when they discuss, like, anything. Because they cover up. It's been proven that they've covered up so much and have gotten away with so much. Because it was easy to back then. It was so easy to. There was no data or evidence you could track. All there was documents that are heavily redacted.
Is that this invasion failed miserably, and JFK and his administration were to blame.
Too long we have fixed our eyes on traditional military needs, on armies prepared to cross borders, on missiles poised for flight. Now it should be clear that this is no longer enough.
JFK would later fire the CIA director, holding him responsible for the disastrous
Good.
invasion.
I forget his name. It just showed it.
Enough.
JFK would later fire
Alan Dulles, the CIA director. Fuck him. Get him out of there.
This didn't change anything. The U.S. government was still obsessed with removing Castro from power. They just needed a new plan. So JFK initiates his own plan, called the Cuba Project, aka Operation Mongoose. Over the next year, the CIA employs hundreds of spies to collect intelligence on Cuba. They send submarines on recon missions to Cuban waters. They fund anti-Castro protest movements, spreading propaganda throughout the country. And they make dozens more plans to assassinate Castro directly, including preparing poisonous pills.
Oh yeah, I've heard of. There's like a ton of plans and operations to kill Castro. I remember hearing one about an exploding cigar that they would give him, and it would explode in his face and just blow his head off. That's pretty cool. That's like straight out of a movie, dude.
In a beverage to be drunk.
Straight out of a
Castro.
spy
They
movie.
Even hired the American mafia
Cigar
to
bomb.
deliver the pills, knowing that the mafia had their casinos kicked out of Havana during the revolution and would want revenge. But none of this worked. The assassination attempts all fell apart. Fidel Castro still remained in power, and his support wasn't wavering. And the U.S. military was getting desperate. They needed to solve the Cuba problem before the Soviets could get more involved on the island. So after all these botched assassination attempts and failed invasions, the Joint Chiefs of Staff concluded that the only way to get rid of Castro was for the U.S. military itself to invade Cuba and take him out. But they knew that the U.S. public would not support an outright invasion. They needed to create a reason, a justification. And
Which is so insane, the fact that our own government, I mean, they didn't follow through with any of this, but the fact that they even like came up with the idea and were thinking upon doing it is just insane. And people, like, it's like that one quote. And people often say, the government wouldn't do that. Oh, yes, they would. Like Iraq, Afghanistan, for example. We lied about weapons of mass destruction, and there weren't any.
The one that went to the Secretary of Defense for the president's approval. This cover and deception plan to make attacks on American targets, fake attacks that will be blamed on Cuba to raise tensions between the US and Cuba to justify an invasion, a
So
legitimate provocation as the basis for a US military intervention in Cuba. In other words, a lie to the American public and the international community, a series of false flags to get what they wanted, and all detailed in this classified document.
Hey, Kennedy's a real one, though, for putting a stop to this and saying, what the fuck? No.
Was only meant for a few people, with hopes that the president would approve in the spring of 1962.
If the
It's
nations
probably
of
what got
this
him capped,
hemisphere
to be honest.
should fail to meet their commitments against outside communist penetration, then I want it clearly understood that this government will not hesitate in meeting its primary obligations, which are to the security of our nation.
So let's see what this plan actually says. It starts with the U.S. military base at Guantanamo Bay, where they would
Gonna
start
arm
rumors
Cuban
using
friendlies.
fake radio stations and get American-friendly locals to
Yep.
stage fake attacks on the base, starting riots in the surrounding area. Another proposed part of the plan was to blow up a U.S. ship and blame it on Cuba. There was the U.S.
Insane.
military in the 60s at it again. The document predicts that the newspapers would start reporting on the casualties, causing a helpful wave of national indignation. They also wanted to create a fake terrorist campaign on American soil in Miami or Washington.
Imagine if Richard Nixon got elected instead of Kennedy. He probably would have approved all this without a fucking doubt. Just like, oh yeah, do whatever you gotta do. Fucking, we need to invade Cuba. So, do what you gotta do. It's probably what he would have done.
So it could all be widely publicized, making Cuba look like an irresponsible government worthy of American intervention. They thought through having American Air Force pilots fly over places like Nicaragua and drop bombs on cane fields to burn them down using weapons from the Soviet Union. But for this to work, they would have to be flying Cuban military-style aircraft. They would need to ensure that their planes were properly
God, this
painted.
is so
They would
well
also use
thought
these
out
planes
and
to
planned out.
harass American civilian aircraft, making it look like it was the Cubans doing this. They planned a fake hijacking of commercial planes to blame the Cuban government or to fake shooting down a civilian airliner. And if that wasn't enough, the Joint Chiefs planned to create an incident which will make it appear that communist Cuban jets have destroyed a U.S. Air Force aircraft while it was flying over international waters
Jeez.
in an unprovoked attack. Operation Northwoods was a reckless plan to lie.
You don't say this is a bit reckless. I'd say it's a little more than reckless. I'd say it's unethical.
Proposed by top government leaders who were more and more desperate to invade Cuba. And they wanted to move fast. They say in just a few months. They needed to do this so that this attack wouldn't involve the Soviet Union, who still hadn't established any defense pact or military bases in Cuba. To solve the Cuba problem. If JFK would just approve this plan, then the military would get to work, blowing things up, attacking their bases, and terrorizing the American people. But he rejected it. Operation Northwoods never happened.
My man.
JFK's rejection of this plan is one reason that there was a rift between
My man's
him
got a
and the military,
backbone.
with the military wanting to take a hard line on Cuba and JFK feeling the sting of the Bay of Pigs invasion, thinking that something like this was too much of a risk. A month
You don't
later,
say.
another document came to him. The
Say it's a little more than a risk,
Joint
dude.
Chiefs following up with another memo saying that the only way to remove the communist regime was military intervention by the United States, and that Cuba was a vital base of operations for espionage, sabotage, and subversion against other countries in the region. The fear was that communism would spread across Latin America because of this, and time is running out. The rift between JFK and the military.
So it was literally
continued during
just
the Cuban
to
Missile Crisis, when the
kill.
Joint Chiefs
So all this was over just wanting to spread democracy rather than communism throughout Cuba. All this is over. God damn it.
Hoped to deploy nuclear missiles against the Soviets and invade Cuba, but JFK stood up to the military once again and said no. JFK
My man's got a backbone, dude.
eventually went on to deny General Lyman Lemnitzer another term as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, likely because of his leading role in planning Operation Northwoods. And looking at this bizarre episode in American history, you might feel like this is a moment where our system worked. Military leaders tried to abuse their power to launch an unprovoked and illegal invasion of another country, but the reality is, all these men have the same goal. Castro out of power and Cuba under their control again. Their disagreement was one of just a few degrees. The means, not the ends. The reality is that the US was one man, just one person, away from this operation happening, from a full-scale invasion. If JFK had lost the presidency to Nixon, would Operation Northwoods have happened?
Yeah, I just talked
can't
about
say
that.
Conclusively, but
I was just
it
talking
certainly
about
raises the
that.
probability. But what's more startling is that outside of a few norms and some ideas about government, nothing fundamentally has changed in our government. The political military machine still runs on the same software it did in the 60s. If the US government felt like it and had a big enough enemy, a big enough threat to American interests, it could happen again.
I think to an extent I can imagine this happening. I mean, I won't get into it, but you could say this same thing for the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. We lied about weapons of mass destruction. So that has definitely happened before in recent years.
The Iraqi
But yeah.
regime has plotted to develop anthrax.
Oh, here we go.
Gas,
I was just talking about
and
this.
nuclear weapons
See,
for over a decade.
he's talking
States
out of his
like
ass right
these
now.
And their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil.
Yeah, see, everything he just said is not true.
The peace of the world.
That's insane. That's a goated video, dude. I'm liking that. Yeah. This is probably, in all honesty, this is probably what got Kennedy killed. So, that was a good video.